everybody. Welcome to the Idea Roastery. It's 2025. I'm Jason.
And I'm Herman.
So, Herman, new year. How's it been?
It's been great. I did some hiking, did some festivaling, got back to work last week, and then work finally slipped into place with some unstable service providers for my infrastructure. So I've been fighting that for the last week. But the convenient thing is that I'm already bold.
Yeah, true. Yeah, I've been chilling in Thailand for since probably like mid-December. After the visit I did down to South Africa. So it's been cool. Lots of relaxing. Also working on a few projects and stuff like that. A couple of things going on, but really excited to to kick off the year. I've decided to do Dry Jan, which is the British version of Sober October. So I've been cutting out alcohol, which has been
hmm
quite good. I think the last drop I had was probably the New Year's Eve. But it's good. And I think it's interesting because I've almost noticed it, maybe just because I've been doing this myself, but there seems to be a trend of people, health influencers, those kind of people, talking about how alcohol is become a lot more worse. Like there's a couple of papers that have come out saying that there's, a sort of non-trivial link between alcohol and some kinds of cancers. And it kind of jogged my thoughts into like the whole area of vices, right? There's other vices that are out there. Obviously, South Africa has a big challenge with alcohol and also with gambling, it appears, because I read an article about how I think it was like
Yep.
was it like 1.5 trillion rands worth of revenue from gambling, and so I kind of wanted to talk about the, I guess, ways to deal with some of these different vices. Obviously, there's a self-control portion of it. There's a degree of like people are independent. I guess they can look after themselves, but maybe we should do something to kind of disincentivize this much naughtiness, shall I call it?
Mm. I guess it always comes down to the scale of the bad, right? So yes, alcohol is the largest cause of violent deaths in the country. Domestic abuses, driving while drunk, getting into a heated argument, and um, bad things happening because of alcohol. But even further than that, inside of, places that don't necessarily have as much violence, is that there used to be this idea that alcohol was healthy if used in moderation, and more research has come out to suggest that there is no amount of alcohol that is healthy, at least from a physiological point of view. If you think of it as from a social point of view, then an argument could be made that, people with a larger number of connections and good relationships um, do live longer, and potentially alcohol could facilitate that in some way, but that's also debatable.
Yeah.
So I understand that, um, but I don't think that banning alcohol outright is the right thing to do, right? But then you have something like fentanyl, right? I don't think that there's a healthy way to consume fentanyl in
Mm,
moderation, and so having an outright ban over there kind of makes sense. It's not like
mm,
let people try it, and they're in charge of their own outcomes. Like
mm.
if they don't like it, whatever. Um, and we've kind of seen in places like uh, you remember when it was very popular for people to point at Finland and look at the heroin clinics in Finland and say like, hey, listen, we should just
Mm.
decriminalize heroin. And so a bunch of other places went and decriminalized heroin, and then they got really bad, like
Yeah.
heroin and fentanyl addicts, and like a crumbling society over
Mm.
there. And so it wasn't that Finland was decriminalizing the heroin, is that they just had support systems in place to help people who were recovering from heroin addiction.
Mm.
And if they were seeking treatment, and if they could go to the heroin clinic and stuff like that, they could get fresh needles and government grade heroin. So
Yeah.
like there's a whole bunch of other stuff
Yeah.
around that. But I think in that case there is governmental incentive to fix it.
Yeah.
Um, and so let's talk about what governments do to prevent these kinds of things.
Yeah, so it's definitely, yeah, I mean, it's in the interest of governments to sort of try and solve these problems because as I guess the challenge is that with these different vices, the main thing is that they're addictive, right? And if you don't have something else to take over that sort of part of your life, it can be quite easy to just fall into this hole. And then I guess with the Swedish case, and I think also, places like Portugal, like providing support, like you can provide support, but I think addiction can be sometimes so bad that even the support doesn't necessarily help. But I guess the one way that
Mm.
governments have tried to help, and this is maybe just the world over, is to provide some sort of taxation on these different fields. I think also, before we go into that, I think it's also interesting that the younger generations have tended to. It seems like they are coming up a little bit more healthier. I think maybe there is a bit of a repulsion against some of these bad players. I think if you look at like big companies like British American Tobacco, I guess sugar could also be thrown in there, like Coca-Cola, those kind of
Mm.
people. Um, Providing a tax on these big companies is kind of a way to like force the companies to, sort of be part, not necessarily part, but like the money that they make will go into funding some of these programs because
Potentially.
potentially, yeah. Um, with gambling, I guess, I think the challenge that I see with it is that, first of all, like with gambling sites, that it's in the UK as well. There's a lot of different sources of gambling, you could say, and I think because of the internet, it's really hard to track down where exactly these companies are, right? So thinking
Mm.
about taxation, uh, it could be a really hard problem because I think at the moment we already have challenges in terms of how you tax companies overseas. And so maybe the challenge uh, is just like how do you implement it at such a scale that it doesn't push it underground?
Mm. What's been really interesting is just seeing the rise of advertising for Betway and Hollywood Bets and bippity boppity boo in South Africa and in the world at large. I think they deregulated it a bit in the United States and then it just exploded. Um, and see, gambling historically was like I don't want to say a niche vice, but yeah, actually a niche vice is a good way to put it because you had to go to location,
Mm,
right? You had to go to the casino, you had to go to the horse races, you had to, go to the betting rooms and place sports bets. And so there was a, quitting or not even getting involved in that. Like
mm,
I've personally never really spent any time in a casino.
mm,
Um, However, right now you have access to that in your pocket
mm,
all the time. Right. So if you are someone who is inclined to gamble, you can go and you can place a bet right now. Now, one of the things that we've seen with, let's say, for instance, social media is that it's really difficult to self-regulate how to use Instagram or TikTok or something like that because it is as if you are a person who really likes cookies and instead of being able to remove cookies from your house and your immediate surroundings, you've just got cookies in your pocket the entire time. So you say, I'm not going to eat any of these cookies, but
mm.
then you carry them around with you all day, every day. And so in your weakest moments, or just like a little lapse in your self motivation and like, oh, you've eaten a cookie,
Yeah.
right? And so now this can be applied to gambling as well.
Mm,
And so you can go and you can just gamble
mm.
all day, every day. You can say, I'm not going to gamble right now. I'm not going to gamble at all, but it's right there in your pocket. All you need to do is re-download the app. Um, and that's a really difficult thing to disincentivize through taxation because they're losing money anyway.
Yeah, yeah. I think yeah, like I think it's interesting because it feels like the outright banning of these things would probably be beneficial. But I think like the case for like specifically t tobacco, like I read about this case in New Zealand where they like started adding so much tax that you could only, they were like almost like armed robberies of like tobacco delivery trucks, because it was just so, expensive to get a hold of. And so it kind of just pushes it underground. Um, but with games as well, I think the gambling industry, the gaming mechanics can be like so addictive that
Mhm.
if you look at like the way that Australia is tackling it, I guess they're like, putting restrictions on people accessing those kind of platforms. So if you think of like the recent ban that they had in not allowing sort of youngsters to get access. I think it works, but then
Mhm.
there's also like, you know, people can quite easily get VPNs and stuff like that. So it's not really that.
It's sort of. I think the difficult thing is funding it, right? But so back, oh, this has got to be 10 years ago or so. A big online gambling company was trying to poach people from the video game industry in which I worked at the time, and they reached out to me and offered me, not offered me a job. They offered for me to come in for an interview, or they invited me in for an interview. And I went and I looked up the company and I, uh, just out of curiosity, dug into what they do. Now, in physical casinos, they go and they try and optimize as best they can for keeping people gambling
Mm,
for as long as possible. And they take it to the logical extreme, right? Stuff like pumping more oxygen into the air vents, making sure
mm,
that there are no windows and artificially increasing the lighting in there so that it feels like it is daytime the entire time. They will even have free drinks to keep people, content and happy to carry on gambling. And in a lot of cases, they'll even have free food because they don't want you to be like,
mm,
I should go and get some lunch because I'm hungry. So you disappear out of the casino and then you're like, oh shit, it's, 1 o'clock in the
mm.
morning. I should leave. No, no, no. They'll bring you a sandwich. Um,
Yeah.
and so now, if you take that, this obviously goes to show that gambling is an entirely it's incredibly profitable to keep people doing it as long as possible.
Mm,
And so this becomes even more insidious when it gets onto digital devices. And so at the time, this wasn't really on mobile phones; it was on in browser. But what they would do is they would run these algorithms that would determine things such as it would pick up essentially when a person gets paid, right? Like
mm,
there was a way that they picked up roughly the when they suspected that a person gets paid, and they'd send off an email
mm,
reminding them to come and gamble during that time. They
mm,
would rig the machines in such a way that instead of just mechanically there being a chance for a payout. Instead, it would feed you little wins. So if you go on a
mm,
losing streak for too long and you're like, I'm gonna give up, it knows roughly when that's gonna be and it will optimize that to be like, give him a little win so he sticks around for longer. And these can
mm,
be customized per user as opposed to
mm,
more broadly to society at large. And
mm.
so that made it incredibly, incredibly insidious. And
Yeah.
it's difficult to regulate away anything specific over there. So, like, let's take for instance the EU, which is the big boy when it comes to trying to protect humans from evil companies, is
Mm,
they would have a hard time saying you cannot have an algorithmic mechanism that explicitly tailors wins on your gambling platform to match the like it's you can see that
yeah.
would add too much bureaucratic overhead. There would have to be auditing of algorithms, which is not going to happen. And so I think with gambling in particular, sweeping legislation that does something along the lines of saying you can't advertise it, right? In the same way that in South Africa
Mm,
you can't advertise cigarettes, right?
mm,
Um, and also saying gambling can only be done on location. So you can't do it via an app. You have to
mm,
go into the betting house. You have to go to the wherever, to the casino,
yeah.
and essentially return it back into a niche activity. So people who
Mm,
rarely do want to gamble, and people can make up their minds to do that, they can go and do that, but they're not coaxed into it.
yeah. Yeah, I think that is a important factor. I think what I'm nervous about is like I guess with a lot of the AI tools and the way that personalization is going is like yeah, you could get into like I mean they're already using a lot of the tactics in for instance social media to keep people hooked in and engaged. And I also imagine that especially in the sports world, you know, if you were to eliminate for instance like alcohol advertising, like I think every sports brand in the world has at least one or two alcohol brands that support that sport, right?
Sports brands are predominantly getting sponsored by sports betting companies now, though.
Yeah, I exactly. So and it's just I think it's such big business because of the way that it just like entices people that you do need to have, you know, a bit of caution around it. And I think maybe pushing into like alternatives, I guess like what people really need to have is a little bit more, I guess, things to do. I think because I think a lot of it is driven by, you know, people not necessarily. I guess one of the main factors is that, like, for instance, if you're, you know, down and out and you know, living paycheck to paycheck, having this like supposed opportunity that they've usually presented as is going to be something that's like sort of preying on you just to like transition away from. So giving people more opportunities, I guess, is going to like eventually lead to that, that people will not necessarily resort to that. But I also worry that if you were to even have them outside, you know, it when designated areas, that people would return to either, you know, drinking or other kind of vices, right? Because yeah, I
Mhm.
think it's just something that, you know, societally, you know, there will always be nefarious things that people do, or things that are like, you know, a way to kind of escape. And I don't think you'll ever be able to like outright ban it, but you might be able to incentivize people to change into something else, right?
I think that there's a really good write-up, and I can't remember if it was by Paul Graham or one of the other big tech people, but whoever it was making the case that the and he was talking about computer infrastructure. The right amount of support queries is not zero, right? And the thesis over there was built on the premise that in order to get to zero support queries, you have to firstly, spend a lot of time and effort planning for every eventuality, make sure that the documentation is stellar, but then also make it very, very difficult for people to get in touch with support and kind of force them into the documentation and create a very bad user experience. And the thesis continues to
Mm,
suggest that if if you force this, then people would just go to a competitor because, they can get in contact with someone and whatever. And I think
mm,
that the same thing can be said for crime, is the right amount of crime is not zero, because if it is zero, then it's diminishing returns. If you have
mm,
one police officer for every 100 people, maybe that will solve 90% of crimes, right? And as you increase the number of
mm,
police officers per 100 people, you will get closer and closer to there being zero crimes. But as soon as you're at the point where it's like a
mm,
one-to-one relationship, it still isn't going to be 100% solved. But boy, have you spent a lot of resources, and you've created like a really nasty police state. And so with gambling is that,
mm,
yes, if you went and outright banned gambling in a country, I I personally think that all the metrics across the board that you're measuring with regards to this will probably improve, because there is actually very little upside that comes from
mm,
gambling. It is very much a trickle up
mm.
economy where poor
Yeah,
and middle income people give their money to billionaires, right? Um,
yeah,
but it does mean that it will drive a bunch of gambling underground, because there will always be a percentage of people who want to gamble. But trust me when I say that that number is going to
yeah.
be minuscule when compared to the number of people who are gambling right now.
Yeah, exactly. I think, yeah, making it less available. I think in maybe in the short term, I think the best approach is to have at least some tax, because I think in the South African case it's not necessarily taxed at all. I think that, yeah, the challenge of having like the internet means that, you know, it's you're never going to outright ban it. And I think going to the extremes of like, you know, internet censorship, I think that can also be problematic from a like sort of liberty point of view. You can't like just start implementing like firewalls and stuff to like prevent people from accessing
Mm.
gambling sites. But I guess to a certain extent, like making it harder to access, like I think that part of it is a problem. Uh, you know, whether it is that, you know, it's illegal or not. I think that the enforcement is also the challenge, right? It's like, you know, once someone has gambled on a site, how does, you know, the government find that out, right? So,
Right. Well, so there's a secondary thing over there, and it also really comes down to like what is considered gambling.
mm,
So I know that Gamblers Anonymous, which is a an organization that treats people with gambling addiction, has a larger and larger percentage of people who are there treating their gambling addiction for trading stocks
mm,
and cryptocurrencies.
mm,
And the fact of the matter is that if you go and you trade cryptocurrencies or trade stocks, you're not it's gambling,
yeah,
right? people need to understand this better that
Mm,
like you're very unlikely to beat the market in the long run.
mm,
And so essentially what you're doing over there is you're having fun and you get the big wins and you get the losses and you come back again and again and you
mm,
try to make money. And so it's very, very akin to gambling.
mm,
And people are recognizing this and they're starting to treat the gambling addiction.
mm.
Now, um, that makes the legislation over there pretty difficult. So
Yeah.
does the United States say, well, Robinhood is considered a gambling
Mm,
application, and so we're going to ban it, or we're not going to allow them to advertise it because,
yeah.
you know, it's a gambling application. But then they could obviously litigate and say, like,
Yeah.
yo, dog, we're a stock trading app for the little guy. You're trying
Exactly.
to put down the little guy, say stocks are only
Yeah.
available to
I guess that definition is also important, right? Because like the if you can't really adequately define it as, I mean, it's like what it's like a risk-taking endeavor, like where you have some sort of probability of outcome. But then you look at like, yeah, as you said, options trading, like people have been doing that for years. And that's like complete
yeah.
gambling. I mean, yeah, it's such a hard thing to even legislate because it's kind of like, and maybe even in a way, it would actually impact a betting site, right? So if you have a casino, like it's an
Mm.
obvious like there's gambling going on here because you've established it. But if it's like a game where there's a certain mechanic where there is a probability, I think loot boxes was also like at some point there was like I don't know if it was last year
Loot
or
box scandal.
yeah, exactly. Where that was considered like a form of gambling, where you just like, okay, well, every day I get to, put money in and then I get like some sort of loot that's going to help me, plant my farm or
Yeah.
whatever.
Well, I think the big controversy over there was that it was targeted at
Oh yeah,
children, right?
yeah,
Because it's like, yeah, adults are allowed to spend their money and potentially get a reward, but children are certainly
yeah.
not.
But yeah, yeah, I think over time it like it's going to become more complicated to like kind of iron out, maybe at least in the gambling sense. But I think maybe, well, I'm hoping that the trend is that you know maybe advertising could be released. But then again, like with advertising, I also think about that case. I think where when tobacco advertising was banned, it just meant that tobacco companies didn't have to spend any money on advertising, so it was actually a net good. So rather than
Mm,
competing on different marketing teams, it was like, okay, well now we don't have to spend any money on marketing, and people are still addicted,
yeah.
so it's not really a problem.
That's the thing with tobacco is that like it markets itself. Like if you take a look at you live in Europe, well you live Europe adjacent, right?
Yeah,
And tobacco companies aren't allowed to advertise over there, and all the boxes have like nasty ass
yeah,
tumored lungs and dead fetuses on it and giant
yeah.
warning labels and everything. And despite that, it has significantly higher smokers
Mm,
per thousand than the United States,
mm,
right? And the reason for that is just like a cultural shift. People in the United States just stopped seeing smoking as cool, whereas
mm,
everyone in Europe still sees smoking as cool. And so it's like a trend that perpetuates itself. And it hasn't really been influenced. And they've even gone and taxed the shit out of tobacco in Europe. I mean, like, you know,
yeah.
I remember this was, 2014 buying a box of cigarettes for 30
Yeah, I
euros.
think also like having it visible is also like with smoking as well. Like what I've seen is obviously there's been a shift from smoking into like vaping, which I mean it's still like visible where you can see someone's vaping, but I think the next shift is quite interesting because it's now these like little like nicotine pouches, right, where you just like pop it in your
Yeah,
lip.
the Zins.
Yeah, and I think the challenge with that is like now you don't even know. There's no second. I mean, there's no secondhand zinning. Like there's no like, but
Yeah,
there is
I
a still
think
an
I
impact
think
to society there, but it's harder to police. And I think the tobacco companies are just going to be like, okay, well we'll just pivot to that, and then also all the
yeah.
countries where they don't have tobacco bans, and I guess France probably makes up quite a fair portion of their revenue sources, but
There's something really interesting about the progression because so we went cigarettes to vaping, right? So it's like vaping is definitively safer than smoking
mm,
tobacco, right? We can say that is completely true. However, it is also completely true that if you vape, you're significantly less likely to be able to stop because you become significantly more addicted because you can puff on it the entire day. Uh, you don't smell,
Mm.
and there aren't like all the big negative outcomes, and you're not sent outside to smoke. You can just kind of sit there
Yeah.
at your desk and puff on it. Um, and in so doing, the nicotine takes a like a lot stronger of a hold on your
Mm.
brain. And so while uh, while vaping has been seen as a smoking cessation device, it is certainly not a nicotine cessation
Mm.
device. Um, and I think the same can be said for those Zyn packets, is that once you start doing them, you are very unlikely to stop doing them.
Mm.
And if you cannot get your hands on them and you only have cigarettes, you will
Yeah.
smoke those
And maybe
cigarettes.
maybe the result we'll need to get to is they'll need to be like an industry of clinics where you can go and like solve these different addictions. And maybe that's where they need to have like the taxation go into like rehab clinics and just like where they put you in a box and just say no. Because that's I guess that's the only way you'll be able to
Um,
help yourself because no one would really even know. It's where it's drinking is like quite a social disobedience.
mm.
You can see if someone's drunk. I mean, obviously, if you drink in your own home, maybe not. But like, yeah, like all these things that you can't necessarily see. Someone might even not be able to help you out because they don't know it's happening.
There's been a bunch of interesting work around looking at the effects of those GLP-1 receptor
Oh
agonists
yeah.
like Ozempic and Wegovy and all of them, and the effect that that has on addictive traits, whether that be
Mm,
alcohol or harder drugs like heroin and fentanyl.
mm,
And this is still very, very early research, but what they've found is that um, these drugs have a pretty strong effect on these addictive behaviors, and people find
mm,
themselves not just eating less, but drinking less and smoking less and
mm,
taking fewer illicit drugs. And that's a really interesting development, and I foresee very soon those GLP-1 receptor agonists being prescribed for addiction. Um,
yeah.
so we'll see if like I'm always afraid to say I'm always afraid to say things like that because it's kind of like semaglutide is a panacea and it's obviously not, but boy is it's pretty impressive.
Yeah. I mean, I think we'll know if it's true if we start to see like an uptick in the amount of people that are coming out with all these like side effects of these different drugs because I guess that's the tactic that uh tobacco companies use is they'll like go after the credibility of these so-called cures. But yeah, I think like what gives me hope is that I guess the younger generations, maybe myself, maybe I'm reflecting a bit more, but I think people are generally tending to look after their health. Whether that's all of the population of the world, I don't necessarily think it's always the
Mm.
case. I think there is a little bit of help that needs to be provided there. But I think the way that I, you know, see the world is I'm being a lot more cautious about like sugars and these kind of things.
Wh-
I think that's not just me. I think that is also from the sort of development of health influences has made it a little bit more easier to sort of live a healthier life um, without
mm.
these nasty addictions.
I so there's definitely been a trend in a downturn in risk-taking behavior, right? So that could be
Mm,
drugs and alcohol, but it also relates to like sex, like teenage sex has gone down,
yeah.
all these other things, and that's obviously a broader conversation to have because there's strong evidence to suggest that it's linked to the hyperconnectivity of the world and social media and people becoming a lot more lonely and not having big groups of friends to negatively influence them. So I think in some ways it could be seen as a negative thing, but in other ways it could be seen as a
Mm,
positive thing. So I guess we'll have to wait and see. But overall,
yeah.
I'm optimistic. I do think that some legislation needs to be put in place around these things. Like it's certainly not perfect, especially around the advertising of them.
Mhm.
But if we're seeing a downward trend in most things that are considered harmful to society, I think that means we're on the right track.